You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Andy Juris grew up on a wheat farm in Klickitat County in southern Washington near the Oregon border, watching his dad and his grandpa work together on the farm. He went to college and became a pilot for American Airlines, but he says it felt like something was missing.
I love flying. That was a fun industry to be in, but you were gone a lot, missed a lot of family stuff. And in 2008, we took the opportunity, my wife and I, to come home to the farm. We currently grow wheat, mostly soft white wheat for export, and we also grow hay sold locally.
Andy is a fourth-generation farmer. He understands the difficulties of the industry, but he says in the past few months, things have changed.
Things were difficult beforehand. The war has complicated that immensely.
Andy's farm machinery uses a lot of diesel, so like everybody, he's feeling the pain at the pump. Since the U.S. and Israel started their bombing campaign against Iran effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, and diesel prices have hit record highs in Washington state.
Any member of the public can see what's happening with fuel, and that pain is the same on the farm.
More than diesel, though, Andy's really worried about the global fertilizer supply, much of which comes through the strait.
We're seeing fertilizer that is priced beyond what crops can pay for.
And Andy says he's one of the lucky ones. He purchased fertilizer before the war began, but his farm only has around 4,000-gallon capacity for both fertilizer and diesel storage. That's not enough to get them through the year. And for now, Andy and other Washington farmers are having to eat the higher costs of fertilizer and fuel. They can't pass that on to customers.
Those input costs are not costs that we can pass on when we sell our crops. All farmers are price takers. We simply call up the Portland grain market, and whatever the price is, and those prices are determined by global factors and what exporters are able to sell overseas, and that's simply what you get. And if those prices do not if they are not higher than what it took to grow that crop, you're backwards. And that's just the situation that you're in. And that's where just about every crop in the state of Washington is currently.
Andy says that right now he's just focused on hanging on through a very wild ride. The next 6 months will be about getting crops out of the ground and hoping for average yields if all goes well and Mother Nature cooperates.
After that, it's pretty murky. Right now, 90% of the wheat grown in the state of Washington goes overseas. And, Asia is absolutely getting decimated right now, as most of their fuel and most of it, comes from oil out of the Strait of Hormuz. So as we see these Asian economies strain and potentially buckle, are they going to, it's a realistic question to ask. Do they have the ability to import the wheat from the United States or anywhere for that matter?
And of course, what happens next will depend on how long the war lasts.
Every day that this conflict continues, the situation probably gets worse, I would say. The potential for prices to go higher increase, and the longevity of the pain increases with each day. So if 6 months from now we're still embroiled in a conflict in that area of the world, I would say that you're starting to see some real geopolitical instability. And anytime that happens, that is a wild ride for agriculture. We tend to feel it first in the ag sector.
That's Andy Juris, a fourth-generation wheat farmer in Klickitat County, Washington. And I want to talk more about these geopolitical forces that are squeezing our state's farmers right now. Here to discuss is Randy Fortenbery, the Thomas Mick Endowed Chair in Small Grain Economics at Washington State University. Professor, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
So I think most people can understand, because they go and fill their own tank up, at the pump, what's happening with fuel prices right now. But can you talk more about what's going on with the fertilizer market? Why is the war with Iran having such a big impact there?
Well, if you think about world fertilizer trade, about 30% of it ends up coming through the Strait of Hormuz. So just as it's constraining fuel trade, it's also constraining fertilizer trade. Now, in the United States, probably 85% of the fertilizer that we import comes from Canada, but we do get some from Qatar, we get some from Saudi Arabia, but it's an international market. So even though most of our fertilizer that's imported comes from Canada, it's still responding to the world price, which is being affected by constrained trade coming out of the Middle East.
And this web of how everything's interconnected, I was reading about how Russia and China have responded to global pressures by stopping the export of a lot of the fertilizer inputs that they produce. So, like, for example, China is a big phosphate producer. They've blocked phosphate exports, which takes about a quarter of the world's supply. I mean, all of this is super interconnected, right, Professor?
It is, and historically, Russia's been a large fertilizer exporter as well. And to the extent that not only them limiting their exports, but that they change who they're actually trading with. So, for example, trading directly with each other, Russia and China, will impact what's available to the rest of the world and what price will have to be paid for importers of fertilizer in other areas.
So as of this morning, on the fuel price element of this, AAA says the average price for diesel in Washington is sitting at about $6.85 a gallon, which is the highest recorded average ever. Breaks the last high, which was set last Sunday. What do those record highs mean for the agriculture sector in Washington?
Well, the agriculture sector is not quite paying that pump price because it's called off-road diesel, so it has a little bit different price strategy, but it's still very, very high. I think USDA puts out biweekly these cost of production estimates for different parts of the country. So in the Pacific Northwest, this last report, they were reporting diesel prices at almost $6 a gallon for somebody like Andy who has to import it to the farm. Exactly a year ago, that price was $3.50, so it's up significantly. But also, when you look at the Portland wheat price, which is where most of the wheat from Washington ends up being transported to for the export market, it was exactly equal yesterday to the price of a year ago. So prices have not improved, and in fact, they're quite low historically, and input costs have gone up significantly, both fertilizer and fuel.
Wow. And that's, I mean, right there is the squeeze that we're talking about. So why is the Portland market that where we sell all the wheat or most of the wheat? What's going on, in terms of how we actually get it out to global markets from Washington?
Well, most of our wheat does go to Asia. And so that's the most logical export facility for us to be shipping to the Asian market. In Portland, they still do a lot of ships that are, it's just one big hole. It's not like container ships. So if you were doing containers, you might be going to Washington port, but the large bulk still moves down the Columbia River to Portland, where it gets put on an ocean-going vessel headed for the Asian market.
So Andy is saying basically that fuel is tough right now, but fertilizer is the biggest concern. Is that what you're hearing just across the board with farmers right now, that the fertilizer is really where the rubber's hitting the road?
Yeah, that really is. And even maybe more so for Midwestern producers compared to us, because most of our wheat crop anyway was planted last fall. So there's some fertilizer applications that some producers might want to do this spring on top of it, but most of those costs were incurred last fall. So it's really about the crop they're going to be planting in next September, October. Again, as Andy said, if the conflict goes on for 6 or 7 months, then those costs are going to be realized next fall for our producers. But also any spring planted crops are vulnerable to these costs. So canola, for example, we often plant in the spring in Washington. We do a little bit of spring wheat, some of the pulse plants that we produce. So it's still critical. We were a little more insulated because we planted last fall most of our wheat crop. But then this fall, we'll be completely vulnerable if the conflict continues.
Can I ask about specifically Washington state policy when it comes to fuel, and something that I hear a lot, especially because we had the big political fight over the initiative that was going to recall the Climate Commitment Act. That's the piece of legislation that created the market where big polluters, big companies that produce a lot of greenhouse gases have to buy the allowances on the in the exchange, and then they've been passing on those prices to their consumers. And in this case, a lot of people say that our fuel prices are higher because of the CCA. And that's something that I've heard kind of in the wake of as prices are getting higher across the country, that the CCA is particularly driving up prices here in Washington. Now, supporters of the CCA have argued that there are refinery and transportation challenges in Washington specifically that play into our high prices, but we consistently have fuel prices that are, in the top 3 in the nation. Do you know if the CCA at this point is having a big impact on farmers? Because they were supposed to be exempt.
Right. What happened was they were supposed to be exempt. Effectively, the retailers, I believe, were challenged to figure out how to exempt farmers versus other purchasers of fuel early on. So in 2023, 2024, basically farmers were paying the surcharge as well. There was a program enacted by the legislature to allow them to apply to get rebates. They had to have some way of proving that they paid the surcharge. So I don't think just a fuel receipt that just had the total cost was sufficient. I believe the legislature initially allocated maybe $30 million to this rebate program. Something less than $8 million has actually been paid out. And that program, I believe, ended January 30th of 2025. And so what's happening now is the Department of Ecology keeps a list of retailers that are willing and able to exempt farmers from the surcharge. And so the farmers can go there, look for somebody that they can buy fuel from and not have to pay the surcharge. Now, how effective that is, I don't really know. How accessible it is for every individual farmer, I don't really know. Are there areas where there are fewer of these retailers available? I can't answer those questions. So really, this transition period, it's unclear to me how it might be affecting producers. But even without that, at the producer level, we still have the second or third highest fuel prices in the United States, even exempting ourselves from that particular tax.
Yeah. We heard from Andy Juris about the issue when you're paying more for inputs and you're getting less for your crop, that you get backwards, in the economics of farming, basically, and that across the board in Washington, farmers are backwards for a lot of different types of crops. And that's borne out by the data that we have. The USDA released a report in September that quantified farmer operators' financial returns, so gross receipts versus expenses. And in 2024, Washington ranked last on that list. So California and Texas saw the most returns for farmers. Washington was the last. And I mean, we're talking about these global forces that make things harder for farmers everywhere. But that's a really stark statistic for our state. Why does Washington see the least return for farmers, especially compared to like a California where the fuel prices are also very high?
Right. Well, there's a couple things. One, your crop mix matters. In California, we're very diversified, but California even more so. I think USDA updated that data in February of this year, and now we're 46th. But the states that are below us are still like New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Alaska, not what we would call big ag states. So we're still well behind. It's interesting because if you look at, so that's the net farm income, we're 46th. If you look at gross receipts, we're like up in the 20s or something like that. So it's really about the cost of production that we face. So compared to California, they do have relatively high fuel prices, but we have very high labor costs, and the overtime law has impacted labor costs for labor-intensive ag. That's not everybody in the ag sector in Washington, but that's a significant number. Clearly, production costs are a huge part of it. I think production expenses, we rank 8th in the nation. And so total receipts, we rank in the like I said, in the 20s. But because of those costs of production, our net farm income comes back down to now being number 46. And remember, that's 2024. So that doesn't include what's happening now with fuel and fertilizer prices.
Yeah, that's incredible. Tariffs have anything to do with that? The global trade, that we are super trade dependent here in Washington?
Well, we are super trade dependent. The tariff question is an interesting one because if we went back to the 2017-18 tariff environment, in the previous Trump administration, that did have a big impact on us. Interestingly, as I said before, and as Andy mentioned, most of our wheat goes to Asian countries, and we don't have quite as much trade turmoil with them as we do with some other trading partners in this current environment. And if you look at wheat exports, for example, they've done much better this year than they did a year ago. So it doesn't look like the tariffs have directly affected our export side, but they do affect the input side. So to the extent we have tariffs on Canada and we're importing 85% of our fertilizer from Canada, that ends up affecting the overall cost structure for producers as well. But that affects all of ag across the U.S., not necessarily us uniquely in Washington.
Professor, when does somebody at a grocery store in Spokane or Seattle start to see the impact of the fertilizer and fuel shock when they go to buy a loaf of bread, for example? I mean, will that roll down to consumers, to all of us who buy groceries?
Yeah, it eventually will. It depends on, when you talk about individual commodities, how close is the farm produced commodity to what's actually consumed by the consumer? So if you think about an apple, a fresh apple, goes from the farm, gets boxed, goes to a retailer. So there's not a lot of in the middle, maybe. If you think about wheat, though, it goes through a lot of different steps before it actually ends up as a loaf of bread. What's most likely to happen on the food side is it won't be the commodity prices at the farm level or the cost of production at the farm level pushing food prices, but it will be disruption in supply chain because of expensive fuel and changes in trade arrangements among different countries based on how they respond to these very high transportation costs. So it's things like insuring a ship that's going through the Strait of Hormuz. It's things like the fuel cost of moving a vessel across an ocean. Those things will start to affect consumer prices. So it won't be because suddenly the commodity price gets higher due to the input costs. It'll be everything that's happening along the supply chain that's disrupting the current trade flows that'll affect consumers more readily. And that can happen in the next few months, again, if fuel prices stay relatively high.
Randy Fortenbery, the Thomas Mick Endowed Chair in Small Grain Economics at Washington State University. My final question for you. We heard the wheat farmer, Andy Juris, talk about his fears about the future. And if the fuel shocks in Asia continue to affect the economies there, will they continue to purchase our wheat? What do you think about looking forward, the long-term sustainability? I mean, are Washington farmers, is this an existential crisis for them, or have we seen this before? They can weather this?
Well, some of them can weather it. Some of them are probably much more vulnerable. It is a situation where it'll eventually correct itself, regardless of what happens. We'll find a new, if oil prices stay at $120 a barrel, let's just say, then there would be adjustments that are made all across the geopolitical landscape, including trade. Some people will survive that. Some people will not. We already have some pretty significant nationally farm level bankruptcy applications in 2025, 2026. So there's challenges even before this current event. If you look historically, though, we've had oil prices this high before. They don't tend to last because what happens is people start changing the way they behave. They drive less. They buy more fuel efficient cars. Now, how long does that take? That's kind of an empirical question. I don't really know. I don't have a good forecast. And a lot of it will depend on what does happen with this conflict. Is there a resolution relatively soon? Or does it actually escalate and even more countries get involved? All of that is an unknown, at least to me, but that will affect how soon we start to adjust to a change in the way we trade and the prices at which we trade.
Randy Fortenbery with Washington State University. Really appreciate your time and insight today, Professor.
Thank you.
You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. And before we go, I asked Andy Juris, our local Klickitat County wheat farmer, what is making him hopeful right now. He says his hope doesn't come from anything in the news cycle. It comes from his community.
The agricultural community, it's small. It's less than 2% of the national population now. And that that makes for a pretty tight-knit group. And so I would say the hope comes from just knowing that we have faced hard things before, and that while nothing is guaranteed us, I think security is an illusion, that we've made it before. And if we're careful, if we know our numbers, if we operate our businesses as best as we possibly can, there is a good chance that a majority of us can hopefully see the end of this.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime right here online at KUOW.org, or of course on your favorite podcast app.